I'm going to start here with the Marion Lykes. The official story is that Oswald, when he got out of the Marine Corps, went to New Orleans, boarded the Marion Lykes, and sailed that ship to France on his way to defecting to the Soviet Union. I think there's some reason to doubt that Oswald was the person on this ship, and that's why this video is called "Was Oswald Really on the Marion Lykes?" I think there's some reason to think that he was not. And just starting here, this is kind of weak here, but it's relevant. In this FBI teletype, it is related that the FBI talked to two of the ship's crew members who were on this voyage, and they said they could not recall Oswald and that his photograph was not familiar to them. This isn't really that surprising. They probably were on lots of trips and had seen lots of people, and it had been 4 years before. But the ship crew members, at least that were talked to by the FBI, did not remember Oswald, and there were only 4 passengers on the ship. It's not like there was a lot of people to remember. But anyway, even though this is kind of weak, the crew members that the FBI talked to did not remember Oswald. Other than Oswald, there were 3 other passengers on the ship, and 2 of those 3 passengers mentioned that they didn't see Oswald do any reading. One of them, Billy Joe Lord, who actually shared a cabin with Oswald, says, "I do not recall him doing any reading." And another passenger, Mrs. George B. Church, said, "I do not recall Oswald doing any reading. However, I gave him a book which he never returned." Oswald, I think, is famously known by people who have observed him wherever he lived, at least after he returned to the United States, as being reading in his free time. That is all he ever did, apparently, when he wasn't working or going out to the store. People said that he spent all of his time reading. I remember particularly in New Orleans, the landlords and the tenants there would say that he would spend all of his time reading on the porch. So Oswald, an avid reader, is not reading on the Marion Lykes, and that might be because it's not really Oswald. And then there's the photography. Mrs. Church, once again, stated that she and her husband took pictures, both movies and snapshots, during this trip, and she recalls that she has pictures of Lord, but does not recall that Oswald appeared in any of the pictures the Churches took. Now that could be a matter of circumstance, Oswald being unsociable and not spending a lot of time on deck. But according to J. Epstein, who said he personally interviewed Mrs. Church, he quotes it comes off a little differently there than in the FBI report. Oswald, unlike other passengers, Oswald went to great lengths to avoid being photographed, Mrs. Church observed. Whenever I got my camera out to take some pictures, he would head in the other direction. He told us he didn't want his picture taken. So that's characterized a little differently than in the earlier FBI report. Now we are being told that Oswald was actively avoiding being photographed. And this is a note that Epstein made. He said other sources were a personal interview with Colonel and Mrs. Church. So Epstein says that he interviewed Mrs. Church, that he's not relying on the FBI reports for this characterization. So if this is true, then Oswald decidedly did not want his photograph taken, And it could be because it wasn't Oswald. It could be because it was somebody else. And he didn't want a record available to prove that it was somebody else. So, summarizing thus far, the crew does not remember or recognize Oswald. This might not be significant because, of course, the other three passengers, the Churchers and Billy Joe Lord, do remember and recognize Oswald. They never, so far as I know, they never ever expressed any doubt that the person they traveled with was the same person who hit the news and was called Lee Harvey Oswald after the president had been shot. And you might be able to explain that away with the Churches because they didn't see Oswald all that much on the ship. But Billy Joe Lord actually shared a room with him for 2 weeks. And you would think that if Billy Joe Lord had any doubts that it was the same person, he would have said so, even though this was more than 4 years later. But I think it's possible that Billy Joe Lord, he remembers the name is given to him, he has been told that this is Oswald, and it may be if the guy that was on the ship looked something like Oswald, that is, it's Harvey, that he would not notice that it was a different person 4 years later. So I think it's still a possibility, even though we have Billy Joe Lord. And I think Billy Joe Lord is the key, and that's why I'm going to get to more with Billy Joe Lord. And the second reason, wherever Oswald lived, he was described as spending most of his free time reading, but on the Marion Lykes he did not read, and on the Marion Lykes Oswald did not want his photo taken. Not conclusive, but it implies that it might not be Oswald. Now, Billy Joe Lord is the Marion Lykes witness who went off the reservation and wrote the President of the United States, the newly elected Jimmy Carter, in 1977. He wrote a letter here, reproduced by or quoted by the FBI in an FBI report. He wrote the president about the assassination and about things that have been happening to him recently. My dear Mr. President, I have refrained from troubling you with the contents of this letter as long as I possibly could, but I have finally decided that a personal letter to you is, in the end, in your interest and in the country's interest. I am simply transcribing notes which I set down about 2 weeks ago, and which concern, and must concern, any leader of this country. I was Lee Oswald's cabin mate on the SS Marion Lykes, which sailed from New Orleans to France in September to October 1959. I have recently been the subject of surveillance, of harassment, of pressure tactics, and possibly of terror tactics. First, in September, when I was teaching in Japan, someone broke into my house, rifled my papers, but stole nothing. I returned to the United States shortly thereafter. Back in Texas, I was suddenly and improbably the subject of a blitz of contacts by telephone from persons wanting to know urgently and insistently what I knew or remembered about Oswald. No one had asked me anything about Oswald since the time of the Warren Commission investigation 12 years ago. The blitz of calls came out of the blue. It was highly improbable, and after the break-in, I was suspicious. I stalled these people, who represented 2 major national publications. During this period of non-cooperation, I received another surprise, another first for me. 2 Iranian gentlemen appeared at my front door. My mother's house was up for sale, and they were prospective buyers. A small ad had been placed in the paper. The Iranians strode through the rooms in a very cursory, almost arrogant manner, paced off the front yard, and drove away. The sale of the house had been discussed on the telephone among family. A small ad had been placed. Only one other couple showed up to look at the house. Neither I nor my mother, who is 63, had ever received a visit from Iranian gentlemen before. One of the parties, which has blitzed me with telephone calls trying to persuade me to tell them what I know about Oswald, is engaged in a very costly project which allows them to locate, interview, monitor, and influence every single available person who ever knew Lee Oswald. And this just in advance of the new governmental investigation by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I finally consented not to grant an interview, but to allow the publication's representative to explain their project to me in person. After a lunch with this researcher, I was told that if I had refused even to meet with him, pressure was in the offing through two Midland men, Mr. Jim Allison, publisher of the ultra-conservative Reporter Telegram, my employer, out of necessity and for the moment, and Mr. George Bush, Jr. The researcher said he had asked an acquaintance, a Mr. Bemis, chairman of the Republican Party in Virginia and owner of a string of hotels in that state, for help in persuading me to tell what I know about Oswald. After this revelation, and when I still refused to be interviewed, the publication's leg man made an effort to purchase my knowledge about Oswald. I refused, and he left. Shortly thereafter, my mother discovered that her telephone had been tampered with. The casing around the dialing apparatus had been pulled out about a half an inch. It was so obvious as to be grotesque. But we cannot doubt that someone entered the house at a time when I was at work and my mother was away. She returned to the house, however, at an unaccustomed time. I have been in anguish for weeks, Mr. President, trying my best to laugh at my apprehensions and to see these events as fortuitous ones. Experience, common sense, and logic persuade me otherwise, so I have been compelled to react to all this in the form of a statement, and it may shed some light on the reasons for the intrusions into my life. Speaking as the man who spent more than 2 weeks in the same ship's cabin with Lee Oswald at the time of his 1959 defection, and speaking as a man who has been the subject of the above-described tactics of cowards, I offer the following considerations to the American people and to people everywhere. It is CIA and FBI relations with Lee Oswald which have been covered up since November 22, 1963. It is the CIA and the FBI which have concealed and destroyed evidence of their relations with Oswald prior to November 22, 1963. It is the CIA which has, from the beginning, fabricated or distorted certain Cuba-Oswald relations and certain Cuban-JFK relations as a smokescreen and decoy to conceal the CIA-Oswald relationship. I can testify, and others can testify, that the CIA did not conduct a real investigation of the so-called defector Oswald in 1959. The CIA has long been concerned about witnesses who can testify to this oversight on their part. 5. They did not conduct a real investigation because Mr. Oswald was a bogus defector. 6. The CIA is concerned lest the knowledge that Oswald was a fake defector in 1959 linking him to the CIA also link him with CIA on November 22, 1963. But there is an impressive body of evidence that CIA used and abused Oswald as late as November 1963. It is the CIA-Oswald relationship and the FBI-Oswald relation which have necessitated the 13-year cover-up. A necessary conclusion is that CIA and FBI elements in 1963 are suspect in the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The assassination of John Kennedy has every appearance of having been our first American coup d'etat. Mr. President, as a man, a father, and a concerned citizen, I believe that you would act energetically also if you were in my shoes. I believe that you should be aware of the fact that one of your fellow citizens does not feel that he is, his wife and 3 children, and his mother are safe in Midland, Texas. I conclude, Mr. President, by assuring you that I have the most enormous respect for you and the most hope-inspiring indications of your goodwill as of your rare ability to lead the nation. Without flattery, you are quite simply the political light of this period in history. God be with you. I apologize for the crude and doubtless offensive tone of this letter. Sincerely, Bill Lord.